Hello, everyone, and welcome to panel number 10, India's Greenfield Urban Future. First off, many thanks to the IIHS for inviting us to organize this panel and giving us an opportunity to be part of this conference. The first 2 days were extremely rich and stimulating and have set the bar very high for this final day. Now, about our panel, although it's maybe not obvious from the title, we're here to talk about a new book. The panel will showcase a selection of chapters from the forthcoming volume titled India's Greenfield Urban Future, to be published this year by Orient Black Swan. It's co-edited by Dr. Ashima Sood and myself. The broader project on Greenfield urban development grew out of our shared interest in a set of themes dealing with the ways that urban spaces are increasingly mobilized and instrumentalized in the pursuit of economic growth, and how these processes are shaping the emerging front lines of India's urbanization. This shift has been taking place in the context of state rescaling and in the wake of economic reforms, giving rise to private real estate development amidst rampant speculation of land, both within existing cities and on the peri-urban frontier. What is most striking is that Greenfield projects give expression to urban imaginaries, whether in the form of brand new cities erected ex nihilo, like Amaravati or Lavasa, I mean, we could cite many examples, or premium industrial townships designed to function as self-contained integrated spaces, or the elusive Greenfield smart city. Equally important, such projects express the intention to ignore or erase existing spaces, to start with a clean slate. Indeed, Greenfield development as tabula rasa was the title that Ashima and I gave to our essay that introduced a first body of work on this topic, brought out as a special issue in the EPW Review of Urban Affairs. The forthcoming volume expands on that issue. It brings in historical perspective with a chapter on the history of new town building in post-independence India. It further elaborates on themes such as highway urbanization, already present in Neha, Sami, and Shriya Anand's work on the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, and also introduces new work on the not so uncommon scenario of failed Greenfield projects. Our panel today presents 4 chapters from the volume, bringing together a mix of the original set of EPW papers, as well as 2 of the new papers. So I'm going to share my screen, give you a look at the, let's see, just bear with me while I find the, there it is. Okay, so this is the table of contents. Apart from the introduction, the book has 3 main sections, infrastructures and corridors, containing 3 chapters, 2 of which will be discussed today. And a second section, land and real estate, with 2 chapters by Gopa, Samanta, and Preeti, Sampat, both of which feature in today's panel. And a final section containing 4 chapters called Aftermaths, a set of papers engaging with the political, economic, and social impacts of greenfield projects of various kinds. Reading our book project through the conference conceptual framework underscores the extent to which binaries are foundational to reflections about contemporary urban development. Even Greenfield is defined in opposition to Brownfield and entails the embrace of the new versus the old or existing city. The categories of urban and rural naturally figure prominently whether we talk about highway and corridor urbanization or airport development and new smart city projects, topics that will be presented in the panel today. And also in Raturakundu's paper, Rajarhat New Town on the outskirts of Kolkata, which documents the encounters between villagers and middle-class residents of new gated communities and their respective placemaking strategies. Rural-urban binaries also loom large when speaking about governance, as Matthew Irikula's paper argues on the case of Electronic City in peri-urban Bengaluru. We're grateful to all the contributors to the book and hope that those who could not take part in the panel have joined us in the audience and will participate in the discussion. So now I will stop sharing and we can get started. So I would like to invite our first speaker, Gopa, Samanta from the University of Burdwan. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Loraine and Ashima, for bringing me here in this panel and giving me the scope to present my chapter. I am also thankful to EHESS for giving us this platform. So basically, I'm going to talk about my chapter and case study, which is the title of this chapter, as already has been introduced by Loraine. So it's an industrial zone to new Skycity, the unmaking of India's first Aerotropolis. It's a joint paper by me and Akash Banerjee, and I'm going to present here. So as already Loraine has introduced the theme that Greenfield urbanization, and it's a large infrastructure mega projects initiative under the neoliberal economy. So part of that process, I'm trying to look at what is the process of making an Aerotropolis in an older industrial region within West Bengal, and I'm trying to, my paper is mostly having policy dynamics, and I'm also trying to look at critically at the process of large infrastructure projects. So it's already, as Loraine has introduced, that it is a new urban frontier in India. So, and such mega projects are often happening under a completely private initiative, and sometimes it is under public-private partnership model. So this article actually is trying to explore the process of making this urban integrated mega project, and especially this is happening under private ownership. So this initiative was started in 2007 under the regime of leftist government, the then leftist government in West Bengal, towards the end of their 34 years term, when they became desperate to develop big industrial projects like Singur, Nandigram, and also this Ondal Aerotropolis. But luckily, this the fate of this project was not ended up like Singur and Nandigram, which failed actually because of enormous local resistance, and which is explained by the social scientists that it is probably the beginning of these projects, actually these resistances in against these projects actually put the seeds of change in leftist regime in West Bengal. Basically, from the very beginning, this project was started under a private company called Bengal Aerotropolis Project Limited, and they tied up with Changi Airport, International Airport, Singapore, that company. And so it's basically, nobody knows that why the logic was completely in a problematic state, because when this process was started, and I was just 50 kilometers away from this airport, and I'm just my location Burdwan is in between Ondal and Kolkata. So I was thinking that, okay, what kind of airport it is going to be built? It is an alternative for Kolkata, or it is an addition to Kolkata, complementary. But why the complementary airport will be built in 200 kilometers away from an existing international airport? So nobody had the logic very clear. But what we see that probably by that time, and there was a desperate attempt from the then government to bring back the track of industrialization, because there was enormous closing of industries during the late 80s and 90s in West Bengal, because in both in Asasol Durgapur development area, this industrial area, and also Hubli industrial area. So that logic was not very clear. Even by the time the government was heavily indebted, they were in heavy debt, and were taking up large industrial projects and infrastructure projects. So actually, what we see that it has started in 2007, and the process of land and the process of acquiring the land was much easier here, because the location itself is very different from Nandigram or Singur, because it was the unproductive, agriculturally unproductive land, and mostly under the mining area. So it was not a big issue to acquire the land. And by the time, there was little protest from some group of people, but it was resolved so quickly. And so here the article is trying to look at a few things like the viability of such large industrial project or infrastructure project, because I'm talking it industrial as well as infrastructure, because they were hoping to develop an industrial hub within the Aerotropolis itself. And they have also named it like industrial city, kind of. So we are trying to examine, in this paper, we are trying to examine the problem of top-down approach in private planning itself without understanding the ground reality. The major problem underlying the success of the Aerotropolis project here in Andal, understanding how it has impacted the local economy, how and to what extent land market changed in the area when speculation of growth was set in motion. And also, although the scale of speculation is not of that level of what Goldman and saw in case of Bangalore Airport project, but I think it is more on the line of Raman's work on Chennai in 2016, where she has showed that informal land markets of the surrounding areas through micro networks were developing. And basically, this article is based on 2 rounds of empirical research carried out, one in April 2015 and then March-April in 2018, because I wrote another paper in Economic and Political Weekly. It was a popular web exclusive, kind of. So in 2015, and from where actually Loraine and Ashima asked me to write another piece for this book. So I was happy to do the field work again. So we can claim that even between 2015 and 2018, there was a change which we could detect, although it was not in that, we can't claim that it is completely a longitudinal study, but it is always good to go back after some time and see what is happening and interviewing the same people whom we interviewed in 2015. So basically, I'm trying to come to briefly to the findings because time is running out. And so what we see that viability question is really in a problematic state, especially for the airport, because in 2015, I wrote the paper before the first flight took off from Andal Airport, and everybody was enthusiastic, like middle class people around that area. They were hoping that, okay, they will get enormous connections to many cities of India. So they were very enthusiastic in some cases, but mostly the people who were having kids or relatives or people around or going somewhere for treatment, etc. So basically, this is a middle class who were happy with the decision, and they were hoping that more and more flights will be operating from the airport, which didn't happen. Actually, it started with Delhi corridor only, Andal and Delhi corridor only, and Andal through Kolkata. So the price was higher than the people wanted to pay for Kolkata to Delhi. And because it is a highly connected, it is located on the highly connected Durgapur Expressway, and 200 kilometers, it is just 2.5 hours journey from Andal or Durgapur to Kolkata. So that was the viability issue was we expected from the very beginning of the initiation of the project, and which still is being continued. And also the passenger, what we noticed that in 2018, the passenger traffic was enormously low and it was giving an immense pressure to the airline companies that and there was an agreement with the government that whatever they are losing, the companies who are operating the flights, that will be compensated through subsidies by the government itself, state government itself, which probably state government could not pay for many years. So they stopped running, but there was always a demand for more flights connecting Hyderabad, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, etc., because there are lots of business group of people who also want to go somewhere out, not only Delhi. So that is also a way of looking at that, why we connect each and every airport to Delhi only, when there are other many dynamics where people want other connections, not to Delhi. So it's not always important that people would be moving to Delhi only. So that is also an important aspect to look at while they plan for operating the flights. So it's a very top-down approach of planning, kind of. And so what we see that always what happened there, enormous change has happened in the land dynamics itself. So as speculation was set in that there would be airport and the city and the industrial hub, there will be enormous increase in. So even in the village, at the village level, we saw that people who can afford, they were buying land quickly, and it's a small and poor people, relatively not better off people, so who had emergency or the need for money, they were selling off the land. So already there is a huge land transaction happening, as we noted from the Land Revenue Office itself. And also what we notice that these hurdles of and two industrial, there is an industrial park within the Aerotropolis. So we saw that two industrial parks already, two industrial houses were there operating, but most of the areas were lying vacant, especially for the residential areas, because it is always quite obvious that why people would move from Ondal, Raniganj. It's an enormous in urban stretch, at least from Durgapur, at least even from before Durgapur to Asansol. The entire area is a corridor, an urban corridor, already developed cities, and real estate development is already existing there, and gated communities, etc., are developing at a very high rate in all these cities. So why people would move to Ondal, Aerotropolis? Because it is not a place like IT sector is not that much, so that it can get a sufficient number of passengers, commuter passengers, who will be opting for flying from one city to the other. So basically it is a heavy industrial zone, and that industries are developing in this area. So the question comes whether it is, as it is not linked to the IT sector, there was no scope for being this airport viable. And so we can see that probably, I'm going to conclude here that still we don't know. The project had to be finished by 2022, which we don't see yet. And also this pandemic has stalled everything, like the development activities there also. So actually the question comes here that why we, and also another important point I would like to mention, that it is under this scheme of industrial city kind of. So private governance is going to be set in there, because it would be like provider and customers relationship kind of. It's a new city ideas, which is also a completely private city kind of thing. So that is a problematic the point of our argument, that why these kinds of cities are more and more coming up, where we overrule the democratic rights of the citizens of a city, where they can participate in the governance, and it is not like the provider customer relationship we try to develop everywhere around the world. So in the new frontier or new urban territories. So I think I have, and if we see that it is not going to work well, at least the airport, then we don't know what is going to happen. Probably it can develop as an industrial park, but we don't see a point of developing this, as it will never develop as an alternative to Kolkata. And also it is not so near to Kolkata that it can serve as a complementary airport to the Kolkata International Airport. So I think I have taken much of your time, and I should stop here.
Thank you very much, Gopa. I think your talk has introduced a number of themes that we will continue to discuss throughout the morning. Some that come to mind are these kind of secondary motivations for some of these projects. underscored the fact that here this is very much an attempt to try and stimulate economic development, create a growth pole around this airport project. Also, you raised the question of the actors driving these projects. States get roped in, but very often it's private actors who also are playing an important role as drivers. So I'm sure we'll continue to discuss that. I'd like to invite the audience to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, and the panelists can reply if they like during the discussion or at the end. So we'll move on to our next speaker. This is Preeti Sampat. She's from Ambedkar University, and the name of her talk is Dholera, the Emperor's New City. So to you, Preeti.
Thanks, Loraine, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to, of course, thank Loraine and Ashima and Sudeshna and the IEHS for inviting me to present my work. Dholera is one of my ongoing research sites, and what I'll try to do is to illustrate some of my arguments regarding India's post-liberalization, urbanization, and infrastructure development processes and policies, particularly since the turn of the millennium, through a brief discussion of the project. And of course, as you'll see, there are so many resonances with what Gopa is pointing to and what I'm sure all the other papers are also pointing to. Let me just quickly show you the one slide that I've managed to prepare, which is from the field site itself. And this is the administration cum Business Development Center at Dholera. It is very cutely called ABCD building in official documents. And as you can see, there are these fields at the back, and all the settlements and signs of any settlements have been nicely erased. It kind of bears a desolate and barren look, kind of belie what is existing on the ground. And the front region is also a seasonal wetland where a lot of the local, particularly bird species and migratory bird species, are sort of inhabitants of this region in times when there's water here. So let me start with my presentation, with my talk. So on October 20th, 2021, a platoon of over 100 police officers descended unannounced upon the fields of Sarasla village in Ahmedabad district in Gujarat. They were called by the National Highway Authority of India to aid their contractors' JCB machines commissioned to build a new 109-kilometer highway linking Ahmedabad and Bhavnagar cities. Caught off guard, the local residents soon gathered around, demanding an explanation for the machines digging up their fields. The fields were being prepared for the winter crop when this unwelcome trespass occurred. Intimidated by the presence of the police, the local residents watched as the machines dug up parallel markings for a 90-meter wide road cutting across their fields. Over the next few days, 22 villages falling under the Dholera Special Investment Region, alternatively called the Dholera Smart City, witnessed similar events. As the last village of the Dholera project, Bawaliari, around 71 kilometers from Sarasla, was dug up, residents became more militant, forcing the machines to stop with a sit-in, courting arrest, and challenging the right of the local state authorities to acquire their land. They soon followed up their protest with a police complaint, a meeting with the district collector, and a flurry of organizing activity across the project area villages. This story resonates across several urbanization and infrastructure project areas in India since the mid-2000s. Infrastructure policies such as special economic zones and industrial corridors have sanctioned forcible appropriations of rural and agrarian lands through the state's power of eminent domain to create world-class and smart city infrastructure. They have exerted tremendous pressure on the conversion of agrarian land and resources into enclaves for development and growth. India's land markets have become increasingly dynamic in this period, and real estate and urban development infrastructures have arguably driven rural and urban land prices into a permanently high price regime. Dholera is one illustration of how the high price regime inserts itself and conscripts rural and agrarian land to what I call India's rentier economy. India's rentier economy is driving urbanization and infrastructure projects ostensibly to attract economic growth through investments in industry and manufacturing. However, there is a need to distinguish rent-driven urbanization from industrialization and concomitant job creation, despite their conflation in policy rhetoric. The transition to industrialization and jobs that such projects promise to unleash remains elusive despite several incentives in the decades following economic liberalization, even as rentier-driven dispossession threatens productive agrarian and other economies around land. Policy, land and property markets, developers, realtors, financiers, labor, resources like iron ore, sand, stone, and water used for construction, and resisting peasants and citizens groups are equally drawn into creating this dynamic of appropriating rent from land in India. Dholera Smart City was announced in 2009 under a new special investment region law of Gujarat. Named after one of the 22 villages comprising the project, Dholera falls along the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor in the Gulf of Khambat of the Arabian Sea. The project covers 920 square kilometers. 340 square kilometers of this area fall under the coastal regulation zone, where construction is not legally allowed under law, leaving 580 square kilometers for project development. The villages within the project area are home to a predominantly agrarian population of about 39,000 people. Locally known as Bhal, the region is rain-fed but falls within the original Canal Command area of the controversial Sardar Sarovar Dam on River Narmada. While canal infrastructure has reached the villages, canal water has not reached the fields as a result of the politics around the smart city. Home to the coveted Bhalia variety of wheat, farmers typically draw three crops from the land, including cotton, cumin, jowar, and seasonal vegetables. Land holdings in the region are typically distributed along the region's class dynamics, with the majority OBC Koli Patels, 62% of the population, owning small to medium holdings ranging from 2 to 15 hectares of land, and a smaller number of upper caste darbars, around 11% of the population, holding larger parcels of 15 to over 50 hectares. There is a smattering of Muslim families with small land holdings. There are pastoralist bharwars dependent on commons and for their cattle, who are members of milk cooperatives in the region. And then there are the local Dalit communities who are typically landless agrarian workers, and there are very few, if any, Adivasi settlements in the region. Unwilling to part with their land, landowning peasants across the 22 villages have forged alliances to form the Bhal Bachao Samiti, spearheading the anti-Dholera resistance. Over the years, the Samiti has mobilized a variety of protest actions against the project, including sit-ins, rallies, petitions, appeals through panchayat resolutions, and also a legal challenge to the constitutional validity of the Special Investment Region law in the High Court of Gujarat. The agitation gathered steam from 2010 to 2015, with residents courting arrest, refusing to allow project officials entry into the villages. In 2015, the High Court of Gujarat issued a stay order on the case, ordering that status quo be maintained in the area with respect to project implementation. Since the project officials were unable to consolidate land for the project, local peasants interpret the status quo as their continuing entitlement over the land. On paper, however, the Dholera project authorities have already claimed possession of the land through an official transfer by the state government of Gujarat. According to the initial project plan, land was to be pooled with the consent of landowners. Having failed to obtain consent and consolidate land until 2014, the project authorities initiated an infrastructure activation zone of about 21 square kilometers out of the 520 total around Dholera village. land for the activation zone was physically already under state possession, but included some additional acquisitions from 4 villages around the area. This is the area where the ABCD building is. The project authorities focused on developing the zone after the court stay order in 2015, and the court case dragged on without significant progress, which is how court cases proceed in our country. With the status quo in place, peasant mobilization in the region went through a low phase after 2015. As the price of land increased in the wake of the activation zone's development, some landowners also reportedly sold their land in private deals brokered by local land brokers. Several accounts by the residents, however, also point out that state attempts at the enumeration and mapping of land holdings have been successfully thwarted by the village residents. The official transfer of the land outside the activation zone to the National Highway Authority and the subsequent marking of the road marks a critical turning point in the life of the project over a decade after it was initiated in 2009. When I met the managing director of the Dholera Industrial City Development Limited, this is a kind of a special purpose vehicle set up by the SIR Authority, Dholera SIR Authority. Early in November 2021, in his office in Gandhinagar, he was accompanied by his marketing and branding manager. During an hour-long meeting, they explained to me that the Dholera project, land for Dholera, was no longer being pooled, but that the town planning provisions under which it was being consolidated allowed for returning a generous 50% of their original land to landowners as developed plots. This was a clear reversal from the early claims of voluntary pooling of land from farmers of the project that I've also written about previously in EPW. Pradyumna Singh Chudasama, a local upper caste farmer with large land holdings of over 50 hectares, who's also actively involved in the opposition to the project and a petitioner to the High Court case, points out that in 2011, the Revenue Department sold land under its possession to the DSIR Development, this is the Dholera Special Investment Region Development Authority, at rupees 20 per square meter. And the authority was now attempting to sell this land to industry at rupees 600 per meter square. The difference, of course, is retained by the Development Authority, where the crucial sort of passing of the surplus rent is taken by the state. Local accounts reveal that powerful politicians have also invested in the land around Dholera, presumably adding to the impetus behind the project. While rent from real estate is anticipated, much like investment in industry is anticipated, rentier gains from land prices are an active constituent of the region's anticipated economic transformation. The final development plan for the Dholera Smart City reveals the active role of rent in the compensation envisaged for the landowners. The landowners are provided with readjusted land and would need to be trained to negotiate the document, the award document goes, with the industry and developers for giving land for industrial use on lease rental basis rather than outright sale basis. Or industrial houses setting up industries could be encouraged to provide shareholding to the landowner. This would help the landowner, the document goes, to ensure regular income from the land allotted to them. So rental income is neatly factored into the compensation. The plan adds that the owners could also be encouraged to invest in housing and commercial uses to have an opportunity for rental incomes, for which people would need to be supported through appropriate capacity building measures. Of course, this is a predominantly agrarian economy, and the most prevalent skills are agrarian in the local region. So, which is why the need for capacity building for appropriating rent. At the same time, there is little actual private investment on the ground. State level bureaucrats in charge of facilitating the development of Dholera claim that investors will come only when there is something on the ground. A highly placed corporate source brokering land deals in the region revealed to me in an interview that while several attempts were made with advertisements and field trips for investors from Dubai, Mumbai, and elsewhere, no investor was interested as there was nothing on the ground. The only buyers of land around the Dholera SIR are those, according to him, parking excess money to gain from future appreciation, many allegedly powerful politicians, or those who cannot afford to buy plots near Ahmedabad. Representatives of two prominent real estate developers I interviewed in Ahmedabad, the Bakeri Group and the Parshvanath Group, also expressed unwillingness to invest in Dholera due to a lack of demand. In the activation zone, contracts have been awarded for a common effluent treatment plant, a sewage treatment plant, and a water treatment plant. One Tata Chemicals project to manufacture lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles is in the offing, but the company has not revealed any details regarding when the plant is going to be initiated. The anticipated futures of Dholera have to contend with the unwillingness of local residents to give up their land and the unwillingness of investors and developers to invest in Dholera's fortunes. It is in the gap between the absence of investor interest and the anticipated rentier gains envisaged as compensation and opportunity for economic growth that a precarious rentier economy trumps productive industrialization as the driving force instituting Dholera Smart City. With the episode of the highway authorities asserting claims over fields, the Samiti has intensified efforts to mobilize residents against the project once again. In addition to sit-ins, police complaints, petitions, several meetings have been held in various villages. Plans are underway to press contempt of court charges against Dholera, the Dholera and highway authorities, and the agitation is once again gathering ground. There is one additional dimension to social land relations in the region. With barely a 10-kilometer buffer zone along the smart city, the Velavadar Blackbuck Sanctuary is promoted as a potential eco-tourist zone close to the city. Blackbucks are on the red list of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as a species in danger of extinction. The wildlife protection laws mandate a 35-kilometer buffer zone, but this has been whittled down to 10 kilometers. In 2019, there was an approval by the Environment Ministry for the first phase of a solar project, which basically claimed that there are no eco-sensitive areas within 2 to 3 kilometers of the Dholera project. The nearest eco-sensitive site is only about 4 kilometers. That's what the approval letter of the Environment, Forest and Climate Ministry document said, and hence there is no sort of threat to any eco-sensitive zone from the project. The key stakeholders, and I think I'll conclude very quickly now, the key stakeholders in the struggle over claims to land in Dholera are several: local peasants and residents across caste and community, the Dholera Industrial Corporation, which is developing the project, the Dholera SIR Authority as the representative of the state government, the national government through its equity in the project, the National Highway Authority, and private capital and developers investing in land parcels in the region are some of these. The state administrative authorities, including police and district officials, the Gujarat High Court, and the Gujarat High Court mediate the struggle. Landless peasants in particular, mediated by caste relations, are conspicuous with their absence. The blackbucks of Velavadar, other species dependent on the coastal zones, cattle reared by local pastoralists, land, soil, water, and their conjoined affordances, including the estuaries and marshes of the region, emerge with more than human stakes. The social relation of rent trumps these more than human social relations and other existing affordances of land. Its realization hinges, Dholera's realization hinges on anticipated and precarious futures of investment and rent. Investment is expected to arrive once basic infrastructure is in place, and rent is expected to accrue as land and eventually real estate prices appreciate with the development of the area into a smart city. These precarious futures and circuits of rent are salient features of India's growing rentier economy. Rent accrues as a redistribution of value. that emerges from the productive economy. Investors and builders involved in urbanization often do not have direct stakes in the productive linkages of whatever they create with manufacturing. Precarious linkages with the productive economy of manufacturing underline contradictions within the rentier economy, limiting the redistribution of value from the productive economy as rent given to all of these stakeholders. This has been termed as value grabbing by some thinkers. These contradictions are intensified with ongoing dispossession of productive agrarian relations. Given skill specialization in agrarian work, land use change from agriculture dispossesses peasants of livelihood strategies. Even in project areas such as Dholera, where returns from rent are factored into compensation to mitigate agrarian and other livelihood loss, rentier activity differentially incorporates landowners, depending on how much land you own, along historical privileges mediated by caste and community. India's rentier economy is forming major axes for the appropriation of value and resistance to appropriation, and playing a critical role in refashioning relationships with land and resources. It is also engendering precarious more than human relations through the extraction of cheap resources such as ore from land, sand from riverbeds, stone from hillsides, construction, and the exploitation of cheap labor for extraction and construction, or the exploitation of biodiversity and exotic species for tourism. All of these undergird these precarious contradictions and metabolics of precarity. Sorry, I think I went over.
Thank you, Preeti. Thank you very much. I think it really, listening to you and of course reading your chapter, it really comes out, how you're building this theory, this larger theoretical contribution around the rentier economy, and really grounding it in your fieldwork-based research. And it's very inspiring work. And I think just a few of the themes that we can pull out, speculation and we know that there's a lot of land speculation, but you also show how the state is also speculating and accruing rents. And a particular interest, I think, is this idea that you have presented, today about this sort of normalization or naturalization of the idea of rent, which really, shows land as a commodity, and that this is the way that people should start thinking about land. And so that's, I think, something that others probably will also maybe build on. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that if you get a chance during the discussion. So we'll move on next to our next speaker. This will be Neha Sami from IIHS, who will be presenting joint work with Shriya Anand. So the floor is yours, Neha.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to present at this panel. It's a real pleasure to present our work here, and as Loraine said, it's joint work that Shriya and I have been doing now for close to 10 years on industrial corridors in India. We're really happy. We were really sort of excited and happy to be part of the original kind of RUA edited collection, as well as this, because for us, this paper and this work set off, sort of almost a decade of work on the question of large infrastructure projects, and sort of set off a larger research agenda for us around the overlaps between economic planning and urban governance, industrialization, urbanization, and economic development. So for today's presentation, I will be presenting briefly and recapping sort of our original book chapter, but also then spend a little bit of time discussing sort of where we have, moved on and built on this work, and sort of where we see ourselves going, as we continue to sort of to study both large infrastructure corridors and a set of questions that have emerged from them. And it really echoes both what Gopa and Preeti has said before, and sort of links up really nicely to what we're saying. So if I could have the next slide. The Industrial Corridor project in the Indian context must be viewed in sort of the framework of a larger economic development push that is being made by the government of India on building infrastructure that to enable sort of better connectivity, which in turn will enable also the sort of thinking goes faster economic development and job growth. This is sort of not necessarily a new idea, as we've heard before. Dholera and the industrial corridors have been in progress and been sort of being planned almost in the mid 2000s. And the interesting thing about these corridors, which sit within this larger frame, is that it is sort of one of the first times since independence that there has been an explicit connection in sort of government policy and infrastructure investment to link urbanization and urban development to economic growth. When we began studying the governance and planning arrangements along the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, our original interest was to actually begin by studying sort of the impact of these large projects on the ground, but we quickly moved to studying how state actors particularly were sort of influencing and sort of using their power to influence particular development trajectories. And we sort of began focusing a lot more on the governance and planning arrangements along the corridor. Focusing particularly on, in the book chapter itself, on the DMIC, which now is sort of the first almost model corridor that has expanded from first 6 and then 8, and now the current count is 11 such corridors that aim to link metropolitan regions, continuing to use this sort of language of leveraging urbanization to drive economic growth, with a particular emphasis on manufacturing and industrialization as a means of creating jobs as well. The Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor planned to create 24 new settlements over a 30-year period, with 7 of which were proposed in the first phase. As you'll have seen from Preeti's presentation before, very little of this, if anything at all, has actually gotten off the ground and gotten built. These corridor projects, however, continue apace to aim to build these kinds of nodes or manufacturing cities, as they're being called, between existing metropolitan regions, with the intent of eventually creating large urban agglomerations that are sort of modeled on the Tokyo-Osaka corridor, which was the original inspiration for the DMIC. If I could move to the next slide, please. So this is the most current version of the ambitious plan for the industrial corridor projects in India, which is now part of the national infrastructure pipeline that has been announced over the last couple of years. The rhetoric and the narrative around sort of the scale of these projects, the kind of sort of ambitions around this type of development, I think echoes very much what Preeti was saying before, is that they're all sort of anticipated futures, which we have yet to see kind of deliver on the ground in terms of the promise of what they aim to deliver. If I could move to the next slide. What we found in our work across the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, and since then, none of this seems to have changed very much, is that while municipal governments were sort of absent, not really involved in the process of development around these corridors, and especially the development of the nodes, irrespective of them being very close to existing metropolitan regions, we found that state governments were reinventing themselves to take advantage of emerging opportunities, and to facilitate and also act in response to uneven spatial development of the kind that the speakers before me have alluded to. We also saw them act across 2 levels. To leverage and use central government attempts to promote specific locations for development and for investment, Dholera being a particular example of that, and an increased assertion of state-level institutions to try and influence central-level programs and policies. And so the alignment of the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor actually was changed because of pressure from the Gujarat state government to include Dholera as part of that, the alignment, and it was originally not part of the sort of the first plan that was made for the DMIC. We also saw them Gujarat being a particular example of the continuing to negotiate with central government agencies to achieve particular outcomes. And we're beginning to see more of that as the Chennai-Bangalore Industrial Corridor builds out in between sort of Bangalore and Chennai, and the governments of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu continue to negotiate with central government agencies to sort of change alignments and achieve particular outcomes that are in keeping with their economic development goals. The other thing that we began to see and are continuing to see is sort of this increased interstate competition. And the sort of the case of Gujarat and Rajasthan, which are the two states that we studied as part of the DMIC research that we were doing, were sort of cases in point where Rajasthan was constantly being pushed to try and achieve Gujarat-like development outcomes. And the government was being pushed to often change labor laws, which actually ended up happening, but also try and adopt sort of land pooling mechanisms, et cetera, to be able to get access to land faster, to be able to build the corridor itself. The urban regions will continue to sort of be pushed and seen as engines of economic growth, but the evolution of power to enable the urban regions themselves to have any active voice in this development process has been slow and almost non-existent in most of the sort of states around the country where a lot of these corridors are being built. And municipal governments sort of are still not major players in the process of these kinds of corridors. If you could go to the next slide. So the thing that we found most fascinating from the work that we've done and we continue to see were the implications that the development of these kinds of corridors had for planning and governance processes in India. The Indian governance structure remains sort of embedded at the state level with strong state and regional actors and weak local government. What we saw was these plans being created at sort of the national level with a lot of international input, particularly in this case from JICA and the government of Japan, which were being planned at the central level, but then sort of executed at the state level by state governments. But the impact, as we saw from earlier presentations, was being felt very much at the local level. However, local governments remain absent in the process of planning and building of these projects. City master plans, for example, do not incorporate any of these projects. A case in point being the Vadodara master plan, which had sort of another set of land uses on focusing on residential development planned for the exact same site where the DMIC was looking to build railway sheds. And so city master plans do not incorporate these projects at all. There's very little conversation that goes on between those who plan the large kind of infrastructure projects and those who are involved in urban planning processes. There's a lack of also, as we see in places like Dholera and other sort of newer emerging settlements and these industrial nodes that are being developed, there is a lack of local governance structures or institutions that are being built and set up. One of the other things that we found, and which we're continuing to find across the country even now, is that there is a disconnect between the scales at which planning is taking place. So economic planning typically tends to take place at the national and state levels, whereas urban planning and sort of planning, regional planning happens very much at the localized scale. And there's a mismatch between these plans and the agencies and institutions involved in the process of planning. We're also beginning to see sort of innovations in the kinds of institutional structures that are being created to build and govern these institutions, special purpose vehicles, hybrid institutions that are actually a blend of public and private interest, where there's almost 50% of the people on those on the boards of these SPVs or regional development authorities come from consulting agencies or other investors who have stakes in the development of these projects. So I could move to the next slide. So building from the work that we've done so far, our findings from the DMIC work and actually the writing of the paper for the EPW special issue led us to dig deeper and expand our work to a set of questions around emerging urbanization trends in India. And I'll focus on three key areas that we've been sort of building our work out on. The first is the role of non-state actors. And as we dug deeper, we found, and the sort of narrative around sort of the enabling of particularly consultants participating in planning and governing processes has sort of emerged as one of the critical outcomes of these kinds of processes. And of course, it's not determined by the sort of the infrastructure corridors alone. It emerged through the JNURM process. It emerged through the smart city process and continues to be embedded in the kinds of development of these nodes and large infrastructure corridor development plans that we're beginning to see here. There are a set of sort of multiple sort of policies, programs, legislative shifts that have actively created the opportunities for consultants to take over what were erstwhile state and local government functions, which include the development of plans. It is not just a question of lack of capacity, but what we're beginning to see is that these become questions of concern because it's leading to an erosion of a lack of capacity within government to actually be able to do and hold planning processes. There's an extreme disregard within sort of consulting agencies for knowledge within public administration, particularly at the local levels. There is, as we saw from earlier presentations, neglect for demands of broader participation and the consistent and continuous insertion of private players into government processes. These are rarely embedded within local culture and practice, which continues to result in the kinds of master plans and infrastructure projects that we are seeing, like the DMIC and other such corridor projects that often fail to address the needs and requirements of those who are actually on the ground, who are living there, and the requirements of existing and emerging urban settlements. And the other kind of really critical question is that of corporate governance failure, which we saw playing out over the last 4 to 5 years with ILNFS, one of the sort of main project management agencies, as well as investors, along several of the industrial corridor projects. Next slide, please. We're also beginning to look much more closely, and this also with policy-facing work, at sort of urban and regional governing arrangements. The scale challenge is one that we're actively working on right now, looking at the way in which economic planning takes place and to try and reconcile sort of urban planning processes with economic and urban planning processes. The other larger concern is that a lot of these nodes and towns and sort of emerging in manufacturing cities are being located very close to small and medium towns, which actually lack the governance structures to be able to engage at all with these kinds of larger planning processes, and therefore end up kind of relying much more heavily on private sector players and consultants, and are actually not afforded the ability to even build capacity on some of these issues. Could I move to the next, please? And finally, the last kind of thing I'll touch upon before I close is that we're beginning to look at the overlap between industrialization studies, industrialization and deindustrialization. It's linked to urbanization and sort of infrastructure development. And so we're really, a lot of this work has been done so far at the national scale, and particularly Shriya's work of late has been focusing on sort of looking at industrialization and urbanization at subnational scales and urban scales of analyses. The question of scales of planning becomes critical here as well. And we're also beginning to do work on sort of the link between deindustrialization and urbanization, looking particularly at sort of this paradox of new industrial settlements emerging right on the periphery of existing cities, and what it does to labor economies, to livelihoods and work within the city itself. And I'll close with that, and happy to chat on many more of these in the sort of Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Neha. That was a great talk. I think this is such an important contribution that you're making to our understanding of rescaling processes that are taking place, through this kind of in-depth engagement with a particular large-scale project like the TMIC. It's been very exciting to follow you and Shriya's, work, your research agenda over the last few years. And I want to flag for the audience your really compelling recent chapter in the edited book on experts in the role of experts in planning. And maybe in the discussion, if we can come back to it, this is really interesting what you were saying about deindustrialization and how, some of these projects, sort of inadvertently, can lead to some form of deindustrialization at the same time that they're trying to promote economic growth. So that's very provocative. Okay, so we will move on to our next talk, which is going to be Sudeshna Mishra, Again, from IIHS, we're really thrilled to have you participating in a panel beside all your other responsibilities. So the floor is yours, Sudesha.
Thank you so much, Loraine and Ashima, for organizing this panel, and it's exciting to sort of look forward to the book. It brings together so much great work. And it's also kind of interesting to go after Neha in talking about sort of the road projects, because some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today is also looking at roads as the entry point. The scale is quite different. You saw a very pan-regional India scale, almost kind of a case with the DMIC. What I'm going to be talking about today in my presentation is actually the two sets of road projects that happened at a city scale. The two cases are in Kolkata and Hyderabad. If you can go to the next slide, please. So these are both the road projects are basically these high-speed limited access projects that were promoted by the state government in the geographic peripheries of these two cities. And the chapter is really an attempt to interrogate not only the role that these roads played in shaping the peri-urban real estate markets that then emerged in both of these cities, but also to unpack these roads as territorial strategies that the state very strategically took, and a very interesting kind of entry point that the state took through these roads as a way to kind of speak to the interest of external investors who were looking at investing in these two cities, and these cities trying to compete in a post-liberalization milieu for external investments. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the two road projects that I'm talking about, the first is basically the East-West Road Corridor project, which was built in Newtown, Rajarhat area in Kolkata. That's the first map that you see. It's a 6.5 kilometer road stretch, initially planned as a 10-lane arterial road, which was then changed to a 6-lane arterial road during implementation, but proposed as sort of a high-speed corridor which would link the action area 1D of the new township that was coming up in Newtown, all the way to the airport in Damdam. And the second project is in Hyderabad and is, of course, at a much grander scale, which is the Outer Ring Road project, which many of you must be familiar with. Many people have written about this. It's a 159 kilometer, 8-lane road project, again, designed as a high-speed corridor with, design speed of 120 kilometers per hour, which is quite a leap for Indian road conditions, as we know. Again, connecting the airport at Shamshabad to a whole set of projects that have come up around this road, around the ORR, ranging from special economic zones to the new IT, almost like its own city, the Cyberabad, Gachibowli area, the financial district, and a whole set of other destinations. That's the second map that you see on the slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the chapter, I'm basically taking, I'm reading these road projects in three ways, right? The first is, really sort of unpacking the idea of how these roads really signal a change in the usual state territorialization practices, and referring a little bit to what has been the practice in India for a long time of using a master plan and subsequent rounds of the master plan to sort of delineate a larger peri-urban region around existing cities, to demarcate that, okay, the city is expanding, the city is growing, and this is the new area which is in that process of, trying to capture and accommodate this new urban growth that these cities are sort of seeing, which is an idea of sort of, seeing a urban region grow, which the gaze is, top down, and sort of seeing it at a kind of a map level. These roads, on the other hand, are a very different kind of way of entering the peri-urban area, where it's not talking about a region, but particular pathways into that region. So just kind of unpacking that idea of how this is a very different kind of a state territorialization strategy. The second is the idea of a state guarantee. Now there's a lot of work people have written extensively on, using Harvey's frame of accumulation by dispossession and the use of eminent domain as a way for the state to acquire land for these new developments to come up, and how that changes the kind of land relationalities that are there in transitional areas, moving from very rural kind of land users to more urbanized kinds of land users. But here I'm sort of actually departing from that a little bit. And I'm looking at these two road projects as a way to look at the state role more as a guarantee for private sector interests and for private sector actions to take place in that. And for this, I'm using really the theoretical frame that is, that was posited by Fernand Braudel, in which he talks about the role really, the role of the state can really be seen in sort of this way of where they are either a regulator and they are sort of, have a certain set of regulations in place to curb the excesses of full-on private sector marketization and still hold to certain kinds of public objectives in place. So, using regulation as a way to do that. And the other hat that it can wear is that of a facilitator or a guarantor, where it's basically acting as the pipeline to facilitate how the private sector is really acting. And I'm going to go into that a little bit to sort of see this kind of a role that the state plays, not, in an explicit use of an eminent domain, but much more of a sort of being in the background and acting as a guarantor to a whole set of private actors that are acting on the field. So I'll go into that a little bit more. And the third, of course, is this question of interscaler strategies. And again, to kind of link to the paper that Neha and Shriya talked to you about, which was that, there are these various scales in which we have to sort of unpack the idea of what's happening around many of these new projects. But in my paper, I'm also going to look at how the kind of, the interscaler strategies plays out in terms of the state government objectives post-liberalization and the ways in which they manifested at this city scale in the peri-urban areas through new institutional modalities, through new government bodies that were created, and almost a projectification that was associated with that. So these are sort of the three main areas that I'm going to look at a little bit. Can we go to the next slide, please? So these are some pictures just to kind of give you a sense of, the kind of geographies that are emerging around these new peri-urban road projects that I'm talking about. This is the EWC that I spoke to you about in the Newtown, Kolkata area. Can we go to the next slide, please? This too is a picture from Kolkata along that road, and you can start to see that there are that they kind of become, these roads are basically the places from where you can see what the peri-urban geography looks like. And these new buildings that are also coming up, in some ways clustered along the road in sort of a ribbon development that's coming up. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a view from Hyderabad, and this is the ORR. This is kind of going from Cyberabad towards Gachibowli area. And again, as you sort of see that this road is sort of allowing a way to kind of enter the peri-urban areas, and there are all of these campuses and new developments that are kind of emerging around these roads. And here, so the argument that I'm really kind of making here is that these roads have to be read as a flexible territorialization strategy, rather than sort of the master plan kind of thing, which is a very coherent, you draw a line on the map and you say, here is how the boundary is extended. Here, we're not talking about boundaries. Here, we're talking about sort of this more ambiguous idea of the peri-urban, and these roads sort of cutting through that peri-urban geography through like particular optical pathways that is making this peri-urban geography visible to somebody who can drive down. These are not walkable spaces, so these are like, as you motor down these roads, in these high-speed corridors, these peri-urban geographies open up in front of you. And that's an interesting sort of entry point, if you think, because in some ways it facilitates, aligns, and amplifies the way a lot of private developers and private investors look at land and the ways that their land colonization strategies really unfold, which is this, that how do I get there? Where is the location? Is it connected to a main road? And the state adopting, really trying to understand how the private sector looks at geography. How does it make geography legible? And then using those strategies as a part of a state strategy to open up peri-urban areas is a very interesting kind of a shift that these roads reveal. And these roads, as you can, on one hand, they offer a gaze into the peri-urban that is quite close to the ground. This is not the map view. This is close to the ground. You can see the geography opening up in front of you. But at the same time, if you sort of see the background financials that are associated with these projects, they also act as bridges to very, very high levels of global circuits of finance coming in from multilateral and bilateral development funding, loans, private investments. It's a way of sort of connecting to those kinds of global flows as well. And it is this kind of a thing about a close to the ground view that's then linking, that has the aspirations to link to these kind of global and national scales, is the very interesting kind of a dynamic that these roads are sort of opening up in the peri-urban areas. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here is, I put down some of the numbers that are associated with what I mean by their aspirations to connect and how they connect to sort of, global circuits of finance. You can see that in both of the road projects, we're talking about thousands of crores of investment, either through development loans, straight out sort of partnerships, equity partnerships that are there between these different government bodies, as well as like PPP kind of things. And at the same time, while they're linking to it at one level, and there is a lot of a narrative that is built around it, which is exemplified in a lot of the marketing literature, the road shows, the kind of investor meets that are happening at the state. But at the same time, you can sort of see that last point, there are CAG reports that have been done on both of these road projects that highlight that there's a whole set of other kinds of real estate dynamics that are also playing out, which is with the local level developers, the middlemen and the brokers and contractors. And many of these are very flawed in quite a stark difference from the way the discourse runs in sort of the marketing outline. So there are cost overruns, there were overpayment to concessionaires, there are high court cases where subsequent, in Hyderabad, for example, subsequent governments have taken, Chandrababu Naidu was taken to court by after the fact that there was all kinds of corruption issues that came up during that time. So you kind of see that there are, again, like various scales at which this is playing out, and these local dynamics are also playing out at the same time. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, I am going to hurry up. I think I'm saying. Now I'll go a little bit into what I meant by the second point about state guarantees. So to kind of, refer back to Brodell highlights that the state can play, like I said, the role of a regulator to curb the excesses of the private sector, can also act as a facilitator and a guarantor for private interests and profits. And in fact, it kind of goes on to theorize that exceptional private profits are not possible without the state playing a facilitatory role to make those kinds of exceptional profits. So the role of the state is very important to allow excessive private profits to actually happen. So in the state rescinding its role as a regulator and giving state guarantees that shore up the private sector, these kinds of exceptional profits become very difficult to materialize in the real world that we live in. And in these two projects, we actually kind of see the state governments playing this kind of a role where they're not necessarily always entering the land market through eminent domain, but they are facilitating land aggregation by the private sector through the planning permission process. I mean, at one point in time, BRADA, which was Bhangar Rajahara Development Authority, had 3 people but for giving planning permissions for the development, for the land aggregation that was happening and giving the permissions that were for these layouts. It was very much sort of, a very quick process that was happening. Again, to give they definitely played a role in sort of holding up real estate prices, because when the government changed and the Trinamool government came into power, they disbanded BRADA because of all of the corruption and the violence stories that were associated with them. And the prices that were there, I mean, which used to be like 7 lakhs per katha, they sort of fell to almost like 1 lakh, 1.5 lakhs per katha overnight, like literally over the next day, the day BRADA was dismantled, these prices fell, which gives a very clear indication of what role it was playing in shoring up, giving a kind of a state guarantee. The third, of course, is that, the signaling that is there from the government side, that we are also interested as land developers. We are also interested as land brokers in this area. And the way that they are using land value capture mechanisms. So in the case of Hyderabad, the HGCL, which is the special purpose vehicle created for the ORR, they're using a combination of SDC, special development charges, and DDCs, which are punitive charges when developers are not going ahead and building in time, as a way to capture some of the land value increases that are happening in the area. So that also is a signaling that is there. Can we go to the next slide, please? The other way that we can see it is in how, can we go to the next slide, please? And the next one. These are just to kind of show you that how these roads, where there are certain iconic buildings that become part of the marketing narrative, but the larger part of the peri-urban areas really look like those photos on the top. They just, they're sort of land that there's not a lot of building that's happening there. But these few buildings that are there within this thing take over the imagination of what these peri-urban areas are about. So there is also kind of a difference there. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here is a story that I think, many people have written about and is understood quite well, is that, this post-liberalization moment where there was economic and political regionalism, where every state was competing to get the interest, to get external investors to come to their state. And you see chief ministers playing a role in sort of, in being kind of the people who were the face of these strategies. And by proxy, the capital cities of these states became the place where a lot of that interest was actually materialized on the ground. Now, at the city level, we see that how for both of these road projects, we see how these are translated through a variety of new kinds of public-private partnerships and new government bodies that are created with a very project-specific governance role. They're not governance bodies, as in they don't have the multitude of government objectives that are usually associated with government bodies, but they are basically created for implementation, for project implementation, as a way to manage project finance, right? So can we go to the next slide, please, just to run through this more. This is kind of a sense of both of the cities of, I won't read these out, but you can see that both road projects were initially associated with SPVs, which were created under the Companies Act, and basically meant to implement these projects on a fast track. Over time, they get consolidated as a part of the development authorities and the municipal corporation bodies in those areas. And so if you look at this situation 10 years down the line, everything looks cleaned up. It looks like the governance structures that we expect to see in these areas. And it somehow invisibilizes this process of fragmented governance structures that were created for project implementation, a very projectified kind of an approach that was taken, how finance was managed. And then it starts to look like the cities that we are familiar with. So it's also sort of this transition from the making peri-urban areas part of real estate markets through project-based governance structures, which then get rationalized and consolidated into governance structures that we are familiar with. And much of this remains invisible. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm actually going to end there, but I also want to kind of say that, over time, this is also talking about some of the stuff is a little dated, but some of the things that we see now is that both the areas are associated. There's a lot of consolidation that's happened. So these are now sort of well-placed, recognized peri-urban locations that have emerged in both the cities. However, at a kind of another level, there are areas that, in Kolkata, there's flood risks in this area. There's in Hyderabad, there's groundwater risks that are associated with that's happening in these areas because of agriculture disappearing. And you kind of see that the kind of solution, the kind of responses that are there from the state to address these kinds of issues are very everyday. They are very repair oriented, have some pumps and open up this thing. And so it's very kind of a small scale thing, but at the other end of the scale, you have a much grander sort of an expansion of the circuits of capital that these projects are tying into. And the narratives have now gone beyond just the peri-urban real estate post-liberalization story to linking it to things like the smart city projects, to green city projects. So for example, in Kolkata Rajarhat, that area is now one of the first in India to sign into the UN Energy Compact pledge. So you kind of also see how these there are now moves to kind of link to other circuits of capital and other narratives that are also emerging around these kinds of peri-urban greenfield projects. So I'll stop there now, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudeshna. Thanks for that talk. I think your work on these territorialization practices are really important, and the way that you emphasize that this is strategic, this is the state in a strategic mode, not just, regulatory but really in the driver's seat with all the attendant impacts on land markets and on resource depletion. I'm struck by the fact that, as you describe these two different cases and from your chapter as well, there's really this evolution happening, there's like this learning process on the part of the state, and we see these tensions between these different roles of regulator and then facilitator guarantee, and that harkens back to Champaka Rajagopal's work as well, and Champaka does have a question for you in the Q&A about that. So I think we'll pick up some of these topics in Q&A, and I'd like to ask all the panelists to keep an eye on the Q&A box, and if you feel like answering, go ahead. We will have hopefully 15-20 minutes at the end to discuss, but we certainly won't be able to cover all the questions. So now it gives me great pleasure to invite my co-editor, Ashima, to come in and give her remarks. Ashima.
Thank you so much, Loraine, and thank you, of course, to Sudeshna, Neha, the entire IHS team for having us here to talk about this collection. And of course, to everybody out there who is listening in, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. So I will, of course, we are really at the end of this, and I will keep these closing remarks fairly short. I want to do a few things, and let me tell you what they are. First, as you will see here, with this slide, this comes from peri-urban Hyderabad, and you see sort of, really a way to situate, hopefully, this project against the themes of the conference, as well as some of the preoccupations of Indian urban studies literature, right? And what you see here is this tremendous diversity, but also there is this tremendous disparity. And then, so the question that this image asks us is really, what is happening here? What is really the relationship between these constituent elements that we see in this image? More importantly, one of the things I will try to do here is, we've had this really rich collection of cases presented. And what I would like to do is perhaps also provide like a quantitative backdrop to give you a sense of what is the size and scope of this phenomenon that we are talking about. What is the greenfield future that we are discussing? And then, of course, also see a little bit about some of the methodological implications that follow given the volatility of this kind of landscape that you see here, there are buildings that are under construction, there are actually buildings that get stalled, there are projects that are in various stages. And we are all coming from multidisciplinary starting points. So we want to figure out, what is this conversation about, and then what are the directions to which this research agenda points us. And I'm really thankful to all of our presenters here because they really laid out what I would want to say quite beautifully for me. So where do we start this narrative? We can start with Lavasa. I think many of you would have heard of Lavasa, this very ambitious private eco-city being developed outside of Pune. Before that, some of you may remember there was actually this utopian vision of the Hotmail founder, Sabir Bhatia, a nano city in Chandigarh, right? And that sort of even failed to take off. I don't think even one brick was laid where it was sort of planned. But I think, there have been sort of a large number of cases, stories that we hear about. But, the smart cities mission in 2014 really sort of brought together a lot of these themes. And we started hearing about places like Dholera. We started hearing about a lot of these settings, which were meant to be sort of the cities of the future, right? Even though the policy framework of the smart cities mission really moved away in a very different direction and went more towards redevelopment, retrofitting, what Loraine has described as sort of this brownfield project. At the same time, I want to give everybody, because I know some of our scholars are listening in, there was a slow trickle of studies through the early 2010s particularly that were looking at this constellation of real estate actors that were shaping this landscape. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Lorena Searle. She had an early study, very influential. Our own Neha Sami, she's here. She had a very interesting study on Nagarpata. Sai Balakrishnan has been writing about sort of this highway corridor urbanization for a while. Hautes, Ronet in Bangalore. But at the same time, we thought it was very important to put this, very small sort of incipient body of work into conversation with other literatures that were equally important, right? And here, of course, we have there was a lot of emerging work around land struggles, around, for example, special economic zones, and Preeti Sampat is here. She's written a lot about that. Also, Michael Levien. There was a lot of, long history of work on satellite cities and industrial parks, right? So there are people like Ranabir Sarmadar, Ratula Kundu, who has a terrific chapter in the book, but she's not present here today. Annapurna Shaw wrote about Navi Mumbai. K.C. Shivramakrishnan did a lot of this, early, laid out the body of work on new towns, right? We call them new towns. And so what we were trying to do with this is really ask this big question, right? This was the pivotal inquiry we were after, which is, can these cases really speak to each other, right? So that is really what this collection is about, as Loraine pointed out. I think the other thing that I want to do is, also give you a sense, and I have a few maps that I want to share with you, which is, to ask really how important is this phenomenon, right? We keep talking about Greenfield future. We talk about, sort of these corridors. What exactly is the scale of this thing, and how will it shape up, right? Now, there's been some recent work that I, along with collaborators, have been doing, and there are actually very few large-scale quantitative analysis that exist, right? But we had some funding from Azim Premji University Foundation, and we identified over 7,000 real estate projects that exceeded about 1 crore in investment. So these are sort of really, as Sudeshna just mentioned, these are really sort of capital-intensive projects, both public and private, but predominantly private. And I will give you a sense of the scale here. So let me tell you a little bit. I can only give you a flavor of this work. Some of it is actually part of this Samaj paper that was part of our edited special collection. But most of all, let me tell you one that few figures. Let me give you, and then I'll take you to the maps. Out of this, over about 7,200 projects or so, about 40% were completed projects, right? So then we immediately, the important question becomes what happens after the completion of this project, right? About 56% were under construction, and this is sort of really a very interesting story that we hear about in the case of Dholera, and potentially also in the case of the Andal case. These are under construction projects. But then also 6% was shelved, abandoned. They just completely failed. And this, of course, this number varies across different geographies. Now, what is very interesting is that the largest projects, right? These were over 1,000 units. If they were residential projects, they were the ones that were most likely to be somehow abandoned, right? And this is what we saw in our data, right? Now, let me actually move ahead and show you some of these maps. And what is the sort of what I call a kind of a speculative map for future urban India. These are actually completed projects. Our database goes from 95 to 2018. Most of the projects, really most of the stats are 98. And you see here, already these kinds of clusters emerging around, these mega regions, right? If you just look at the population of the projects, you see, Delhi NCR, you have Mumbai, Pune, just almost becoming like a single cluster. You have Hyderabad, Bengaluru, Chennai, Kolkata, and these are really, the top 8 urban agglomerations in India. And these are really where a lot of these projects are coming up. Now, let me tell you how this has worked out over a period of time. And here, this is a chronology. The first map shows you projects that were completed till 2002, and it's a very sparse map. Maybe it's also a reflection of the database itself. The second map is to 2010, and you start seeing, a lot of these private projects, right? And they are already, you can see like these, concentration developing. You see, sort of Pune and Mumbai a little bit, discrete that you can see. And then by 2018, you see two things. This is the last map that I want to point out to you. Two things happening. One is that, the private projects are just so much more numerous, and we actually have the number in this. I will be happy to answer any questions you may have about this. And of course, the private projects are very much concentrated, spatially concentrated, whereas, the public projects seem a lot more dispersed, right? And then, this sort of becomes even clearer when we look at projects that are under construction, right? So these are under construction projects, and we are showing, who are the promoters, so there are very few that you might be able to see that are promoted by foreign companies. Most of these are Indian promoters. And again, you see, how much of the concentration we see here. And, there are, of course, some pockets. In fact, Asansol is sort of one of the little pockets that we also see here. So what does this say to us, right? What is the significance of, these cases, and how do they, sort of speak to a lot of what we are seeing in the data, right? One of the things that I think is very important is from a methodological perspective, because, when you think about marquee projects like Lavasa, or even the delays that we see Andal or Dholera, they present even epistemic challenges. How do you sort of understand this phenomenon, right? Because it is volatile, unpredictable. Economists and statisticians would call it, you have stochastic outcomes. You don't know how it's going to play out, right? So we do need careful quantitative analysis, but I think we also need to sort of close attention to the micro processes that are shaping the unfolding of these projects on the ground. And I think what these case studies do is that they really delineate a lot of the patterns that we see in the early stages and the kind of dynamics that they trigger in their surroundings. And this is something that Sudeshna talked about, Preeti talked about, all of these cases to some degree touch on this. And of course, I have to say that, sort of the larger perspective on the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, right? For example, this gives us a sense of, how all of these cases connect to each other, right? And once again, Sudeshna's work also does that quite beautifully. I think the central point that we are I think that sort of comes out of, a lot of this quantitative work and the case studies is that real estate capital is remaking the cartography of the urban in India and across the global south in unprecedented ways. And this is really in a way opposed to this kind of subaltern urbanization. And so have it as it may, how do we transcend these binaries, right? It is clustering unmistakably in the vicinity of the India's largest mega cities and million plus cities. And it is creating this kind of, it is a speculative map because we don't know how many of these projects are in fact finally going to pan out and, sort of have a life after completion, right? And I think we're just beginning to trace the implications of this on all kinds of issues, as Neha said, about governance, migration patterns, the informal urban growth that will happen here, the social spatial inequalities that they are going to ignite. And this is the research agenda that we are hoping will open up conversations among scholars, students, practitioners across disciplinary and geographical boundaries. And let me close here with this image. Finally, a lot of my own field work has been in Hyderabad. That's my site. And, these are two images of these two possible kind of greenfield futures. You see this image of these women. They all work as domestic workers in, this gated community that you see in the far backdrop. And this is in Gopanpalli village in the outskirts of Hyderabad. This is just in an area that has been utterly transformed by this kind of real estate capital. The second image is actually a very high profile project, and let me not name it, might be able to catch a glimpse of it. Publicized a lot, advertised a lot, promoted it a lot. But, when I saw it in the around 2015, 2016, it was really sort of a, group of unfinished buildings opposite this really small village temple, right? And that was what it was, right? So there's sort of this volatility in this kind of future that is being shaped for us. And this is the conversation that, we invite all of you to be part of. And just to mention, very glad to be part of this all women's panel for a change, but we hope to hear from many more of you in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Ashima. I think that's a really fitting way to sort of conclude the presentations in the panel by, sort of pushing, fleshing out what we mean by, greenfield urban development and trying to go beyond the sort of, imagery and description, and to actually attempt to build and not just attempt, but to build an empirical database on these large-scale private projects that are coming up across the country, and really build a case for what you're calling, real estate capital, and how it's remaking at least the large cities. And what's interesting is to, is to talk about that in the same conversation with subaltern urbanization, with agrarian urbanization, and not see these as binaries. So thanks very much for that. I think what we'll do now, we have 20 minutes, which is wonderful, to start the Q&A, and I want to invite the panelists. We'll go back through this time in order and allow you to select those questions you'd like to engage with, and I'd like you to also invite you to ask questions of the other panelists if something they've said has sparked a question. So I'll let, so I think each of us, why don't you just take let's say 2 minutes, not more than 2-3 minutes, so that we might have a chance to have another round. We'll start with you, Gopa.
Yeah, hello, thank you, Loraine. I see a lot of questions on my case, but I'm trying to answer a few of them. I start with Arunima Ghoshal's question, who is asking what is the role of the state government at this moment. In fact, what I'm presenting, that is before pandemic situation. I never visited the field after pandemic. So what I'm presenting, maybe it's a 2 years back case. And this case is the entire project is unfinished, and not much buyers, especially in the residential sector, and empty lands are still there, and as not many buyers are there, and it's the construction cost and time, it is not going to be finished within time, and so it's leveraging, like, it's increasing the stake from 11% to 26% in that project. So government is at this moment pumping money into the project so to make it viable somehow, and it has become like a prestige issue for the government as well. And another question was thinking about this viability. I think it was raised by Nathaligasa. Actually, what he was trying to say, that why it has happened a different case in Singur, where there was a lot of resistance, and it's a different case. In fact, if we try to understand the political economy behind and the fight between the leftist government before and the present Trinamool government, so you see that, you can see the difference, because it's not that only case that these geographical conditionalities were different. While Nondigram and Singur was highly productive farmland, and this the space allocated for this Ondal airport, it was not like, it is not, I won't claim that wasteland, but it was not a very productive agricultural land, so to say. So land dynamics was a bit different, and encroachment of land was not much of a problem there. So it doesn't relate. Actually, it's not the simple case of it is not a comparable situation. But another thing I want to bring in, actually, I worked on Singur and I wrote a paper in EPW on the classification or urban classification issue. And that time I took, I argued that actually probably Singur was eligible to be a municipal town, which was not done before. And I claimed that if Singur was declared a town long before, so usually the land conversion process was automatically would start there, and probably this industrial building activity in the beginning of this century would not turn up in that way, what we saw. And also we see that when it was like a Singur case was a big issue for the government and political issue, not only that we can explain this only from the economic and financial perspective. So it's completely a different case. And coming to the Rajagopal's comment that whether we see that, and also Moinakrai has raised the issue of viability. In fact, and another person has commented on this binary, productive, unproductive, good or bad, but we are not buying the binary here. We are trying to understand the complexity around the whole process of these megacity projects. And in case what the viability is, in fact, if we take that it is an industrial park, then definitely it would be viable because it is part of the big industrial region itself. And what I'm claiming, that I'm not claiming that it is not viable industrial park, but I'm claiming that it is not a viable city building process, which is termed as Aerotropolis. So my argument would be, yes, it could be a viable industrial park project. I'm not denying, because it's already the industrial sector was flourishing under private capital in this area. Big industrial houses got closed in 1980s and late 1980s and 1990s, but new small scale industrial sectors were coming up, like sponge iron, etc. So in that sense, it could be a very good. And also another point I would like to make, even if it was decided to build an airport, then I would think that I won't claim that there is no traffic demand for passenger traffic demand for the airport itself. Yes, it could be. It could be like Udan's case, Udan program of the government, like small airport and smaller flights, probably it could be profitable, and it could be done in a different way, but it was not thought of. And instead they started running a bigger domestic flight, and which with a limited with a passenger demand was high. So probably it could be. And another point has been raised by Moinakrai or somebody else, that it could be the cargo traffic could, if the air cargo passengers cargo traffic could be probably higher, which I never looked into. And my point point is my another limitation is I'm not a background from economics, so I really don't understand much of the equity and other economic models kind of, and I'm a geographer from the background. So what I was trying to see is how the whole urban situation and the dynamics of visible land development was taking place. I would also like to add another point, how state government is facilitating this development, because already municipal corporation called Asansol Municipal Corporation, 3 years back, that Asansol Municipal Corporation was expanded to that extent that it engulfed 4 other cities. So you see that how this political economic decision of developing expanding the cities and incorporating the in-between agricultural lands between these cities are coming up within the corporation. So it is another way of setting in motion the land development process. So I think I should stop because others are also going to reply.
Thank you, Gopa. Thanks a lot. Now, for the other panelists, you may not have time to address all the questions. Those are the rules of the game, but we'll do our best. Preeti, please come in.
Thank you. No, I think Gopa has actually answered a lot of questions for all of us, but just that I just wanted to emphasize again that, I mean, the whole sort of precarity of this push towards infrastructure development and urbanization, where what I'm trying to sort of point to is, on the one hand, you don't really have investments coming in, industrial investments coming in. And if you think about rent from land or income from land appreciations that we are noting everywhere along these corridors and projects as a moment of circulation of value, where rent or value is being appropriated from that circulation of value, right? So in that sense, what really what is required for that cycle to even go on and not go bust as a speculative bust, right, is that there is enough surplus value being created and generated through productive activities, right? And if you don't have industrial investments coming in, or if you don't have other kinds of productive investments coming in, even though you fix productive, whatever, you try to fix capital into land through real estate and urban infrastructure provisions, if there aren't allied activities, if there isn't sufficient linkage with further surplus value creation, this thing is deeply precarious, fundamentally contradictory. This process can actually just lead to empty landscapes. We have seen again and again where you are seeing these kinds of half-finished projects, or even where projects have begun, they've never really realized even 70% of their whatever potential. The CAG has been talking about the SEZs. There have been so many cases. The gift city is another example. There are so many cases that we can think of from among our own case studies as well. So in that sense, it's really this precarity that is very, very worrying. And the sort of an automated cycle of continuing to reproduce these geographies of infrastructure development and urbanization, despite this precarious link. And of course, I mean, I don't need to say, we all see again and again, these reports in newspapers all the time. India has missed the manufacturing bus. We can only hope to sort of make good on service economies. And then, of course, the kind of service economies that are possible are never commensurate to the kinds of economic development that is anticipated or required. So there are deep contradictions that are occurring at a much wider scale that I think we need to sort of focus on, which are important to see, because these are not isolated phenomena. I mean, there is a reason why these empty landscapes, if you will, are being produced again and again, or unrealizable landscapes are being produced. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you, Preeti. That was very clear. And for those in the audience, I invite you to look at also Preeti's exchanges with Carol Upadhyaya and Pooja Ravali in the Q&A box. Next, Neha, would you like to come in?
Actually, I see that Shriya is here, so I might just hand over to her in case there were any comments that she would like to make, particularly on your question of deindustrialization and urbanization. Shriya, if you're here, and would like to
Yeah,
respond.
hi everyone. Thanks, Loraine and Ashima, for really putting together this wonderful conversation. Yeah, I'd really like to just pick up. I mean, I think Gopa and Preeti have already addressed a lot of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat box. But Loraine, just to pick up your your prompt on thinking more about the deindustrialization question, and I think it really does speak deeply to what Preeti was just saying, right? The kind of assumptions behind some of these modes and models that have been adopted, like the SEZs, the corridors, all of these infrastructure projects, is a particular imagination of how the industrialization trajectory is to unfold in the Indian context. And I think, we have enough and more evidence that, it isn't playing out in that way. And I think really what Neha was referring to briefly when she spoke is that we are trying to really push the thinking on this question of what is really the relationship of industrialization with city build out processes in the Indian context. What we do know is that a lot of the sort of formal manufacturing has kind of moved out of city areas to the peripheral to the peripheries or to further rural areas, whereas actually you see an intensification of informal industrial production within city areas. And really, I think what we've been trying to do is really push ourselves to go deeper and to theorize, like, what does this then mean for that relationship between urbanization and industrialization? What does that then tell us about a lot of the hypotheses that drive some of these larger projects, and showing sort of the why they don't finally materialize the way they were imagined. So just wanted to leave it there.
Thanks very much, Shriya. That's really great, and it allows me to also make a shout out to another chapter in the book, which is by Vijay Bhaskar and Suresh Babu, about the IT corridor in Chennai. Because they show very convincingly how this new infrastructure for the new economy and the service economy replaced more traditional manufacturing and workshops, and really, the labor force then, had to either those jobs disappeared or they relocated further away, and so there we could really, see in a specific case how that happens. I think that's a very important point. Thanks very much. Neha, did you want to add any more, or should we move on? Okay, thanks. So next is Sudeshna.
Thank you, Loraine. I think I'll pick up. There's a question by Champaka, and I think I'll also respond briefly to the point that Carol is making in her question. So Champaka, just to kind of respond to thanks for pointing that out. And I think it is important to kind of distinguish between, sort of the explicit forms of financial guarantees that are also, sort of happening with the government, national government and state governments, underwriting loans, underwriting credit lines, and underwriting land costs in many cases in terms of the equity that they're picking up in the project finance of many of these mega infrastructure projects. And so while there are certain kinds of explicit financial guarantees that are also, that have to be considered within this frame, the language that I'm using around state guarantees in my paper is actually coming more from a theoretical and conceptual perspective, and using Brodel's vocabulary in sort of saying that there are both the explicit as well as tacit ways in which the state ends up facilitating the role of the private sector. And some of these tacit ways is, sort of implied in the local politics of these areas that I'm also talking about through my case studies. And it's true for many other locations as well, and other people have written about it as well, where it's more of a sense where the private sector is convinced that the state, that the people in the government are behind them, that they support what it is that they're doing. And in Kolkata, for example, it was signaled by the government through forming special, 11 new public-private partnerships with 11 of the biggest developers that were functioning in Kolkata at that time. One-to-one partnerships for proposed housing projects, not even necessarily always where there was a concrete project in hand, but also in many other ways in terms of like where they could, do land acquisition. And just to take the language of one of the developers, when I spoke to him, he was like, we are the ones who are planning Bhangur Rajarhat. It's not the government. We know what to do. We are the ones who have been here for a long time, and it's us. And so, this idea of them knowing that what it is, that they have the agency and that they have the state's backing to kind of go ahead. So it's also sort of this idea of the state guarantee that plays out in both tacit political support as well as more explicit forms of financial guarantee that are written into the project financing. The other point I want to pick up briefly is Carol's point, and thank you so much for the question, Carol. I think that's a very important thing to kind of keep in mind, that we often tend to kind of look at the US, UK, regional economic models in a way that, where it's written from those geographies that, infrastructure is a way of sort of catalyzing economic development in the region. And there are economic plans that have been made to kind of translate that. And when we're looking at sort of the Indian case, we sort of see how that progression, that linearity is broken by the fact that the role that the infrastructure is playing is really to sort of, create pathways to what then ends up being real estate projects or speculative investment projects, or, the using land as a way to hedge future kinds of investment portfolios that might be coming up. And this kind of a role where the infrastructure is also playing a strategic role, not just in sort of the production and accumulation that emerges, but is actually a part of that production and accumulation that is being facilitated through these projects. And I think it's important to kind of, think about that kind of progression in the Indian scenario, where the infrastructure is therefore not, sort of an incentive for economic development in quite the same way as it is theorized from the UK and the US case examples. So point well taken, that we really need to kind of then be very forensic about these projects and the planning of these projects and look at them in this situation. So I'll stop there now. Thank you so much for all the insights and the questions.
Thank you, Sudeshna. I agree. That's a very important point to kind of wrap up with. Now we're getting very close to the end of our time slot, but we're going to take just a few more minutes. I'm going to pass the baton over to Ashima, and I want to take the opportunity to shout out also that Ashima has really done the heavy lifting for this forthcoming volume. And thanks so much for that, Ashima, and thanks to everyone. It was great being part of this panel. So Ashima, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I mean, I want to thank all of our panelists. I know it's a tough time, with the new wave, and it's just, been wonderful that at least we could be here and just hear each other's voices, see each other. And thank you, Neha, Gopa, Preeti, Sudeshna, Shriya, and most of all, of course, Loraine. And, thank you to all of our participants. I see there are so many thoughtful comments and questions. And, this is just a conversation that we are getting started. Please feel free to reach out to any or all of us about these works. We will, of course, a lot of these papers have previously appeared in the Economic and Political Weekly Review of Urban Affairs. They have been substantially updated and are forthcoming in this volume with Orient Black Swan. And so we do invite your reflections. And I do want to give a shout out most of all to those of our panelists, and those who are contributors rather, who are not here today. We have starting from the back, Ratula Kundu, we have Anna Devade. She's not able to make it. There's also Vijay Bhaskar and Suresh Babu from Chennai. We have Matthew Idikula, who's written very evocatively about electronic city. I'm also thinking about Sai Balakrishnan, of course, now at UC Berkeley, who's not able to be here. And thank you so much. Hopefully we've been able to address a lot of these comments that have come in. Thoughtful comment by P.N. Narayanan, who's actually here PhD scholar in our program at Anand University, and I think she makes a very important, contribution. And I think the point that she's making, which is really at the heart of this project, is that our work sits at that intersection of the practice and sort of the critical examination of it. And this is really where we hope this volume will find its readership, will find its engagement, to recognize that in fact, even as we are sort of trying to build a new right, sort of this sort of fresh vista, sort of leaving behind everything, trying to bypass what already exists. There are in fact broken systems that need to be fixed, and it's the bypass cannot always be a successful strategy. So with that, thank you everybody, and I think we'll just set time and goodbye, and be in touch.
Thank you. I just want to add that we'll now go into lunch break for the rest of and come back at 2:30 for the rest of the sessions on the final day of Urban Arc. So thank you again, and we'll see you all at 2:30.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.